We continue to get you ready for the start of New York Giants training camp with our look at the Giants defensive line. That's coming up next on the LockedOn Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. Patricia Chenna here with you. Happy Monday, everybody. We are getting you ready for the start of New York Giants training camp. The rookies report on Tuesday. That's tomorrow. And the full team reports a week from tomorrow. So we are getting you ready. We are looking at the Giants position units. And on today's show, we're going to take a look at the defensive line. So happy to have you with us. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day, or watching on YouTube, your first watch of the day. Today's episode is brought to you in part by BetOnline.net. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the games start. All right, folks, on today's show, like I said, we're going to be talking Giants defensive line. And this is an interesting unit because not a whole lot of ink, if you will, has been devoted to this unit the way the ink has been devoted to the offensive line. But yet there are some similarities. And I'm going to talk about some of that on today's show. We're going to talk first off about a little bit of history, recent history. Then we're going to go into what they've done. And then we're going to close it out with some questions. So let's jump right in because we got a lot to cover on today's show. All right. When I think of the Giants defensive line, once upon a time, and not too long ago, actually, this unit was a strength. All right. I mean, hands down, it was a strength of the team. This was a unit that just, for whatever the reason, the Giants drafted well at the position. If a guy left via free agency, there was always somebody in the waiting in the wings to step in and play for the guy that departed. And it just seems the last couple of years that hasn't happened. And let's go back, if you will, to when Dalvin Tomlinson left in free agency a couple of off seasons ago. So Dalvin Tomlinson, really the last of the true homegrown defensive lineman, not counting Dexter Lawrence, who's still on the team. Dalvin Tomlinson leaves. And what did the Giants do? Instead of having a guy in reserve to replace him, they brought in Austin Johnson from the Tennessee Titans. So in that regard, they kind of went away from, similar to what the pass rush was doing, where the homegrown guys kind of dried up a little bit and they had to go out into free agency and get some guys, to come in and be ready to fill in the gaps. So Tomlinson leaves, Austin Johnson comes in, and, Austin Johnson wasn't horrible. I mean, he had a decent year. He went on and he got a nice free agent contract. So I don't think we could say he was horrible. But between that, and I think I think if you throw in Dexter Lawrence's development, I mean, Dexter Lawrence in 2020 looked really like he was on his way. And then last year looked like he took a little bit of a step backward, which I'm going to talk about a little later on. So basically you would now have a defensive line, which once was strength, the unquestioned strength of the team, in my opinion, that suddenly just wasn't as potent. And, I mentioned, I didn't mention Leonard Williams, but let me just mention him real quick. Leonard Williams, in 2020, we all know he had that great season for the Giants, double-digit sacks. And last year, the production dropped. All right, his tackles went up, but his production dropped. Quarterback hits, quarterback pressures, and the sacks. Still decent, but not, what we have come to expect from Leonard Williams, who is making, a pretty penny these days. So you sit there and you say to yourself, how much of Leonard Williams's drop-off, if you will, was a result of maybe not having Dalvin Tomlinson in the lineup? How much of it can you say was a result of, losing Blake Martinez? I mean, you can make all kinds of arguments for that. But I think the biggest factor in Leonard Williams's drop-off was not having Dalvin Tomlinson. And Leonard himself, before Dalvin left, he often spoke about how much Tomlinson has helped him in the lineup, doing the dirty work, which would free Leonard up to basically get inside and put the pressure on quarterbacks, get the sacks. And then when he lost them, again, Austin Johnson wasn't bad, but not quite the same as Dalvin Tomlinson. So as I see it, that was kind of a big loss for the Giants and a big reason why the defensive line probably isn't the unquestioned strength of this team anymore. It's a close second, maybe I would say, because again, it's not a bad unit, but for me, if I were ranking this unit, the strength of the units, I don't think I would put the D line as the number one unit as I would in the past. So that's kind of where things are a little bit right now as they stand. The Giants having lost some personnel, some guys that they had developed, trying to replace them with free agent mulligans. And here's, the similarity with the offensive line, which I mentioned at the start of the segment. The Giants offensive line kind of did the same thing. They took the same approach last year, where they basically didn't have any real young talent sitting in the wings, and they brought in all veterans to serve as the backups. Well, that works to a degree, but at some point you better have some young guys in development, because if you don't, the units and the talent is going to dry up and it's going to get weaker. And I think that is another big reason why the defensive line got, you can't say that it's a strength. I can't say at any rate that it's a strength. So that's where things are. Now, coming up in the next segment, we're going to talk about what the Giants have done to rectify the situation. So stick around. We'll be right back. All right, Giant fans, we have more coming up on today's LockedOn Giants podcast. But first, BetOnline is the only place that offers the best information on the latest odds, contests, and player props for all your sports betting needs. No matter what sport you're into, betonline.net has you covered. Plus, they offer everything you need to know for live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. So head on over to betonline.net today to learn more about the trends and the action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the LockedOn Giants podcast. I'm Patricia Traina, your host. We're talking Giants defensive line as we continue our look at the individual position groups, getting you ready for the start of training camp. It officially kicks off on July 26th. And before we continue on with our discussion of the defensive line, which NFL stars move the betting line the most? Well, starting on July 18th, which is today, LockedOn gives you the 50 most valuable players in the NFL from the odds makers at BetOnline. It's available July 18th on LockedOn NFL or wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. And spoiler alert, folks, there is a Giant player on this list, and that Giant player is ranked pretty high, probably a little too high in my estimation, but I'm not going to tell you who. I'm not going to tell you where. You'll have to tune in and you'll see I do have commentary on it. And that's on that special LockedOn NFL podcast that you will want to check out. Really good stuff. All right, let's get back to our discussion on the Giants defensive line. And I want to talk a little bit about what they've done to address and maybe make this unit a strength again. And the first thing that comes to mind, I mentioned in the last segment, the Giants kind of let some of the young depth dry up a little bit. Well, they have gone now and they have brought in some younger guys to maybe replenish that depth, guys that can be developed, like DJ Davidson, who was a draft pick. They have a couple of undrafted free agents, Christopher Hinton, Ryder Anderson's another guy. So they are trying to replenish the young depth. And another thing they've done that I'm not so sure they really had last year, even though they deployed Austin Johnson in this regard. They don't really have, or I should say, they finally have themselves a true nose tackle. All right. It's just, it's a veteran. It's Justin Ellis. He signed on a 1-year deal, comes in, replaces Austin Johnson. And by the way, just a side note, but is anybody else besides me curious about whether Dexter Lawrence could function as that nose guard moving forward, as opposed to playing on the end in the 3-4. But anyway, Justin Ellis is now the nose guard, or the projected nose guard. There'll be a rotation, I'm sure, but we'll have to see, how that rotation works out in training camp. And here's another thing that I think is kind of flying under the radar, but I think is going to help that defensive line get back to being a strength. And that is this defensive system. You're going to see a lot more twists and stunts. Now, we haven't seen a lot of that in the prior system run by Parhizkaran. I'm not sure why that was, but we just didn't see it as much. Wink Martindale, however, is really into that. And he's into that so much so that in the springtime, the Giants defensive linemen were actually running drills doing twists and stunts. All right. So for those of you who don't know what a twist or a stunt is, basically it's the same thing, but you don't know what that is. So you've got two linemen that line up, and then at the snap, they kind of crisscross. So to create confusion, and they attack gaps and whatnot. And the idea is, again, to create confusion for the offensive line. Who are you gonna pick up? Sometimes a guy will loop around, and then you'll have a stunt that way, or just different little things. And Wink Martindale does these little tactics to create confusion and get pressure on the offensive backfield and on the quarterback. So that's a big thing that they have been doing, and something that I'm really looking forward to seeing, because the Giants offense used to get that done to them a lot, and they couldn't pick up a twist or a stunt to save their lives last year. Now it's time to flip the tables and hope that the defense can inflict the same kind of embarrassment on opponents. All right. The other thing I want to talk about that I think it has flown under the radar with the defensive line, and this is something Dexter Lawrence revealed when he spoke to the media during the mandatory minicamp. That is now there's kind of like an expansion of knowledge amongst the players. In other words, Lawrence said that everybody has to know each other's responsibilities. And that's not so much because, if somebody misses a tackle or gets held up, another guy's going to come in and clean up, somebody else's mess. But again, you look at the twists, the stunts, the exotic looks, the amoeba defense that Wink Martindale also tends to run at times, where guys are just milling around the line of scrimmage, and you don't know who's coming, who's dropping and whatnot. It's important to know what the other guy's doing. And that is expanding the teaching and the learning by the players, because the more you know, the more you'll be able to do, and the better you'll be able to execute some of these complex schemes that the defense is going to call for. And ultimately, the goal is to make it look like a fine-tuned machine, have everybody choreographed and ready to, just at the snap, boom, everybody hits and does what they need to. But just little tweaks to the defense. The defense, we talk about, we use the word aggressive a lot when it comes to describing defenses. And it's interesting because aggressive, we all know what that word means. It just means, you're in your face, kind of get after you. But there's different types of aggression in terms of playing defense in the NFL. You look at Patrick Graham's system, for example. A lot of times he tried to get home with just a 4-man rush. Wink Martindale, I think, is going to try to get home with more men. Now, the reason why, obviously, you want to do have as few men as possible get home with the rush is because you probably want to devote guys in coverage. And that's going to be interesting, speaking of which, because, the Giants, I think they need to see what they have in the defensive backfield that those guys can cover. They think they can. I think they can, depending on if they stay healthy, that is. I think Aaron Robinson, who's projected to be the starter to replace James Bradbury, Adoree Jackson, those guys can cover. So I think the idea there is, again, to send an extra guy, get that rush, because when you send just 4 and you have 5 offensive linemen blocking, plus maybe a running back or a tight end, you're not going to win very many of those battles. So Wink Martindale, with this system up front, he wants to win the battle in the pit. That's where it starts. It always has. Win the battle in the pit, impose your will on the opponent, and just see what it brings. Because if you can get that penetration, you can get that pressure, you then start to dictate the terms of the game. And that's what the Giants want to do. All right, folks, coming up next, we're going to wrap it up with some questions about this defensive line unit of the New York Giants. Stick around. We'll be right back. All right, Giant fans, we have more coming up on today's Locked On Giants podcast. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck or struggling to make ends meet, it can be really stressful when unexpected expenses come up. Well, now Dave can help you get out of a pinch when you really need it. Dave is the banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. That's more money to fill up your tank, buy a wedding gift, or catch up on your bills. There's no interest and no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app to get the financial relief they need with extra cash. So if you're in a pinch and you need a little extra help, download Dave. That's D-A-V like Victor, E, today from the App Store. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. Future you will thank you. Terms and conditions apply. Instant transfer fees apply. Visit dave.com/legal for complete information. Banking provided by Evolve, member FDIC. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the Locked On Giants podcast. I'm Patricia Traina, and we are getting you ready for New York Giants training camp. We're looking at each Giants position unit, kind of giving you a little overview, answering a few questions, looking at, where things are, where things might be headed, just getting you ready because, come July 26th, the team reports for training camp. July 27th is the first practice. August 1st is projected to be the first padded practice. And that's, ladies and gentlemen, is when we're going to really be able to tell you how far along this team has come. So I am excited to bring all that to you. And again, I thank you for tuning into the Locked On Giants podcast. All right, we are talking Giants defensive line. Let's talk about a few questions now that I have about this unit, things that I kind of would like to see resolved as we get through the summer and into the season. Number one is, can Leonard Williams' numbers rebound to 2020's version as opposed to 2021? Now, again, Leonard Williams wasn't horrible last year. His production did dip. I suspect part of it, like I said earlier, was due to the talent around him. Leonard Williams, if you think about it, was really the main force up front. And, just in thinking back, how much were they able to scheme him? I think opposing teams started to double up on Leonard Williams and take their chances going one-on-one with, the other guys, because the Giants really didn't have that good and consistent outside pass rush, short of maybe Azeez Ojulari. So I want to see Leonard Williams kind of rebound. Now, do I think he can make double-digit sacks? I wouldn't rule it out. I would be happy if he could get to maybe 8 sacks. I think I would take that. I just want to see an increase because, I think he finished with 6.5 sacks last year. I'd like to see him bounce back and just, start being more effective, which, again, not all his fault. I think in this scheme, Leonard Williams is going to be poised to have a much better statistical year. And more importantly, listen, I just want to point out, while sacks are the end result, as long as you're getting quarterback pressures and you're moving the quarterback off his mark, that's just as good as a sack. Forcing a guy to throw the ball incomplete or maybe make a mistake that results in a turnover, I'll take that as well. Just want to see Leonard Williams maybe, improve his numbers a little bit more, get back on track. I think he will. All right. Another question I have involves Dexter Lawrence. Now, Dexter Lawrence, he had a really good year in 2020. Yeah, 2020. He had 4 sacks in 2020. Last year, he had 2.5 sacks. And I went back and I was kind of curious to see how he was deployed in an effort to kind of figure out, is there something that jumps out as to maybe why his production dropped off a little bit? Now, I've mentioned, I've questioned whether or not he belongs at nose guard. I believe he did that at Clemson, but the Giants haven't really done that as much with him. And, Dexter just last year, not as potent as he was maybe the year before. The only thing that I could come up with in looking at how Dexter Lawrence was deployed is that in 2020, according to Pro Football Focus, he played 133 snaps directly over the tackle. That number jumped up in 2021 to 221 snaps over tackle. Now, is it a matter of the opposing tackles were just swallowing up Dexter Lawrence, who's a big enough man, by the way? Is it a matter of, the angles that he was being asked to take or the gaps or that he was being asked to attack? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, just looking at the rest of his alignment snaps, he played 40 fewer snaps. I'm sorry. He played 36 fewer snaps in the A gap in 2021 than he did in 2020. His B gap snaps were about equal, maybe off by about 50, but, still pretty much on par. So bottom line is I'd like to see for Dexter Lawrence to just kind of, beef up that production a little bit more. I just felt like, at times there were games last year where, it was like, is he even playing, And Dexter Lawrence, again, I think this defensive system is going to unlock a lot of production for these guys. Lawrence was very excited about this system. They all are, really. And I know what you're probably thinking. You're probably thinking, well, they're not going to speak badly about the system. No, they're not. But you can also see it in the way they practice, in the way they attack it, in the enthusiasm they have, that this system potentially is going to set guys up to be more productive. All right. The last question I have is, it involves the young guys, and that specifically, how quickly can they get them up to speed? Now, I don't know off the top of my head who's going to make the roster from the young guys. I would think DJ Davidson, the draft pick, would, but they've got to get out there. They've got to compete. The important thing is you want to get these guys up to speed, because here's the thing. Justin Ellis is signed to a 1-year deal. Ultimately, you want to have guys in the pipeline who are ready to replace him, maybe later on in the year, if not, obviously next year. And right now, as I said, the Giants, they kind of let that defensive line depth dry up a little bit, that homegrown depth. They do have some other guys that they can turn to, some familiar names. Like, for example, there's there's David Moa, who, was with the team last year, but they also have, some undrafted free agents, Jabari Ellis, Christopher Hinton, Ryder Anderson, Jalen Holmes, who was assigned, I think, from New Orleans, I think he was with. So they have some guys, but right now it's kind of, this group, not a whole lot of experience, I think, behind the starters. And that to me is a little bit of a concern. How quickly can the Giants bring these guys up to snuff? So overall, you have a very functional defensive line unit. It's not the strength of the team, in my opinion, at least like it was the last couple of years, but the potential's there for them to regain that crown. Now, will they regain the crown at the end of the season? Well, keep it here on the LockedOn Giants podcast as we follow that and all things Giants, and keep you up to date. So that is going to do it for us today on the LockedOn Giants podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day, or if watching on YouTube, your first watch of the day. Now go ahead and make your second listen of the day. The Locked On NFL podcast, our national NFL experts and insiders keep fans dialed in with the league's biggest stories and latest news, because an offseason doesn't equal a break in the action. And with training camps getting ready to start up, there's going to be plenty to talk about. So we'll be back tomorrow. Our summer break is over, so we're back to 5 days a week. We will be back tomorrow. We'll look at another Giants position unit. And coming up at some point, if not later this week, it'll definitely be next week, we're going to bring back Twitter Tuesday. So if you want to get your questions in, you know what to do. All right, Giant fans, until tomorrow, I'm Patricia Traina. Everybody, thank you for joining in, and we will see you tomorrow.